Hello guys, so we're ready to get started. I have a very soft voice, and so I'm gonna try to yell basically. Does it sound like I'm yelling? No? Good. I feel like I'm yelling, so okay. So my name is Amy Lee Lawson, and I am a designer and photographer and navigator at Mapbox. And so essentially I approach cartography like a designer. I do cartography like a cartographer. And I'm a navigator because I like to help people understand the complexities of our stack and of our platform and get started with some of our tools. So just a little bit about Mapbox. Mapbox is a location data platform, and we're changing the way that people explore the world. It's a pretty lofty goal, definitely. But the way that we do that is by providing people with building blocks and the building blocks that they need. I have two sheets here. So yeah, the building blocks. So basically these are, this is an example of a courier service. And so what happens with this is that a person drops a point saying that they need something picked up. With the geocoding API, you're able to indicate the lat and long, the latitude and longitude of the location. With turf.js, it approximates the area around, the spatial area around, like within 2-mile radius, to find out what points people can pick up from it, the courier can pick up from it. And then the next thing is the directions API. So that tells couriers how to get from here to there, and so it gives them all the turn directions and instructions. And then finally, it's the vector map. So the vector map is what we're really going to talk about, and that is the beautiful light gray map that you see there. So the guide to map design. So some of you may have gotten this in your inboxes this morning. It's a 80-page booklet, and it was just released, the guide to map design. You can also find it at mapbox.com/mapdesign. This guide was written originally for Mapbox cities. And when I was working with the cities, I realized that a lot of people were kind of getting stuck in between, I know what I want to do, but I open up the video and I see a whole bunch of layers and buttons and I don't know what to do. Or I look at the API docs and my eyes gloss over. So what I wanted to do was kind of create a bridge or a guide for them to kind of figure out what it was that they wanted to do by breaking it down into parts, like approaching it like a design. So looking at the design elements, identifying what those would be related to their brand and product, and then applying principles, the principles that are really good for map design and photography to these different elements. So cartography is the design and data synthesis, and it balances information, color, readability, and accuracy. The essentials of good design are the key to making a map that guides and encourages visual exploration with quick comprehension. Successful location-based applications provide well-integrated mapping experiences where maps are responsive to user interactions and environments. These maps continue the brand experience. They're not an afterthought, they're not generic, but they're an integral part of the whole. Modern mapping tools like Mapbox Studio and Mapbox make it easier for everyone to design a map, custom map, and everybody from a seasoned cartographer to a data specialist to a designer to a hobbyist. So under the hood, what we're looking at, that previous map style and all the styles, they're actually being drawn directly in the browser. So that is what allows us to be able to do real-time styling, styling based on the environment, styling based on what people clicks on and decides on, styling based on the time of day. And so that automatically can be changed. What you see here on the left is the style specification. So luckily, you don't have to write JSON, which is this is JSON. This is going to be written for you on the back end by Mapbox Studio. But these are the specifications that tell the renderer, be it the mobile browser or the web browser, what to draw, how to draw it, that type of thing. And this on this side is the actual map data. This is the vector data. So vector is like 75% smaller and more performant than a raster tile, which is what people used to use back in the day. And the vector data also allows for that runtime styling as well. So that's what we look at under the hood. So the guide basically leads you through the processes of defining what the design elements are and need to be for your map. Something that you can probably look at your style guide to identify, the colors and typography, pattern and texture, the iconography. And so this guide is just meant to kind of get you to establish that before you jump into the technical part. The design principles are meant to, as you continue to design, because it's an iterative process, you have to look at the map in different locations because it's a global map typically, so you have to look how the road networks look in Boston versus the road networks in DC, which are totally different. Depending on the classification of the data, things are going to look different, and also depending on the terrain, things will look different as well. So just some of the things that you need to consider as far as like applying principles like visual hierarchy, color contrast, other types of contrast as well. Those principles are also outlined in the guide. And also the guide talks a lot about that vector data that I mentioned before. So Mapbox, our cartography team prepare and curate OpenStreetMap data. Has anybody heard of OpenStreetMap? Yes. So OpenStreetMap is basically the Wikipedia of map data and information. So it's planet-wide, and it basically lets you know all of the man-made and natural resources and map features around the planet. So what it then is transferred to is the point lines and polygons that you can use as the framework to draw your map on top of. So the cool thing about this is not like a vector, how we would think about it like an illustrator, like a vector layer. It's actually a vector map, so the data there is really crucial. And you don't have to necessarily worry about drawing your own roads or making sure that you have points in certain places because that already is going to be considered. And also it talks a lot about the Mapbox core styles. So these are the styles that are available directly in Mapbox Studio. We have Mapbox Light and Dark. Those styles are made specifically for data visualization. They're a very subtle palette. They work well with vibrant colors, and they don't have as many features called out. It's a lot more subdued. The one in the middle is our flagship. That's a very general purpose map. It's good for navigation, pretty much anything. It's Mapbox Streets, and it pretty much shows all of the features. There's lots of highway shields, there's global transit icons, so if you're in China, you can see the proper icon for the metro, that type of thing. The one to the right of it is Mapbox Outdoors, and so that one is more specifically for if you're doing something outdoors, hiking, the paths and trails are accentuated in that style. Yeah. And the next one is Satellite Streets, so that's using our global satellite data, and it's also applying just the light touch of labels for places and roads and that type of thing, and highway shields as well. And then the final one is our navigation map, which has a traffic layer that's incorporated into it. So when you open up Studio, you'll have any of these maps to choose from. And depending on your project, you can just say, hey, I'm just going to go with streets and move on. Or you can say, I want to use streets, but I want to alter it a little bit. So when you are looking at the guide, you're like, okay, I have these design elements, I have my principles, so now I'm going to make these color changes and these shifts and not worry about messing anything up as much. So let's talk a little bit about some of the design elements that you're going to see. So the first one we talk about is color. Obviously color being a very basic thing, but very important as well. Not really following, so just not so yeah, color, just the guide really defines the elements that you need to consider within color. It's really important to have a strong palette, but something that's pretty limited. So between 10 to 12 different colors is really typical for a general purpose map. You can also see here that there are tints and slight variations. Playing with the value, making something a little bit brighter, playing with the saturation, that type of thing is really, really good for map design. So you start off with your core, and then you kind of fiddle and play with certain things to make sure that the whole map is harmonious together, but still has that variance and differentiation. Here we have an example of Mapbox Streets. So this is using the color palette, but this is a lot more subtle. So these colors, the saturation has been brought down quite a bit. And then there's color to indicate hospital space or school space, parks, that type of thing. And also it's a very iterative process. So you might start with the palette, you're like, this is gonna be awesome, and then you get in there and you start to realize that the colors are vibrating a little bit too much for a legible map. So keep in mind that you might have to go back to your palette, make some changes and alterations based on how the colors are working together on your map. And then you also can use color to categorize things. So within Mapbox Streets, we make sure that all of the transit icons all have the blue color. So we have the metro icons, the bus stops, and also the airports, that type of thing. So obviously using color to kind of group things and help people make those visual relationships when they're quickly taking a glance at their map. Next element we're going to talk about is typography. Now obviously typography, another one that's very important, probably one of the most important. So within the cartography team, we spent tireless hours finessing and kind of working with the typographic hierarchy. So typically what you can do is you can go in with your typeface, download it, install it into Mapbox Studio, and be able to access it directly in Studio, and replace the different labels with your type. Now, all typefaces, of course, are created different, so that's something that you need to consider. You might make the change and it kind of not look as hierarchically sound as you want. So just keep an eye on that. And sometimes the map, the typography that you have for your brand or your product doesn't necessarily look as good with the map style. Sometimes it can be a little bit too vibrant, or it can have a little bit too much personality. So Mapbox Studio comes with lots of awesome fonts that are kind of like super family. So they have like bold, super bold, they have true italic, they have light. So you want to look for a typeface that has like all that diversity so that you can have some differentiation in your hierarchy. So you see how many labels that we see here. It's really important to be able to have a typeface also that has a very large X height, because at smaller sizes it'll be a lot more legible. For Mapbox, we typically use DIN. DIN is a font. And it has really high X heights. It's kind of slender as well. It looks really good at small sizes. And we really just use these 4 different weights. One thing that I talk about a lot more in detail in the guide is specifically about the fallback fonts, because typefaces typically are not made in all of the different characters in the world. And so usually we try to go to a Unicode typeface that has all of the characters in it. So if you're using a map and you have it set on a language that's local, you might not have Arabic characters in the typeface that you have. So make sure that you identify a fallback font. Typically we just use Arial. I think that that's the automatically the one that pops up. And that's Uniface, so that will have a typeface that then is swapped for whatever your typeface is to make sure that it's on the map there. And beautiful types. So we know, the X height is very important. Also the Counterspace is pretty important. And I just called out the terminal because typically a sans serif font works best. There's some, of course, serif fonts that can add personality, usually good for like water labels or something like that. In the guide, I talk about multiple different styles that we've released, some of the Add a Map designer styles that you guys might have gotten in your inbox, and talk about the personality of the typefaces, because that's another thing. Sometimes you want to have a map that has lots of personality. Maybe it's a thematic map, something like that. And sometimes you just want to have a general purpose map that works for everything, and you want to have something a lot more subtle. So think about the personality too when you're choosing your typefaces. So iconography. This is also very important. We have created a set. It's actually a Mach-E icon set. This is an open source project. Anyone can contribute to it. So if you're like, oh, I want to add, you know, a teddy bear, or I want to add an iguana, or like something like that, well, that'll probably be hard. But whatever it is that you want to add, you can go to this GitHub repo and contribute, and we'll look at it and make sure that, you know, it will work with the set. The cool thing about Mach-E is that there's an editor for Mach-E. So you essentially, these are all SVG files. They're all in a JSON document. And you just upload your JSON document, and then you can decide what color you want things to be. You can also group things. It's going to make a little more sense when I show you this. So this is taking from the Mach-E icon set, and these are the icons that I'm using for satellite streets. So since it's satellite streets, I'm looking at different terrains, some land that looks extremely red, some things that is, you know, green and lush, and cityscapes as well. So having white icons with a subtle little gray kind of back outline is really helpful. And then just keeping this as a real kind of simple set. So within the Mach-E icon editor, you can actually go in there and group things together, like it groups the outdoors and the different transit icons, and then the general points of interest, or POIs, as well. So it saved us like days of work, because I mean, imagine just like going into Illustrator, opening every image, changing the color, saving it, making sure the SVG is saved properly, and then uploading them all back in the studio and being like, oh, this one's wrong, and then having to start over again. So it saved us a lot of time. And this is what satellite streets looks like. So we can see kind of the struggle there with the different terrains and the different cityscapes, and having to kind of solve for global rendering is a nice challenge. So now we're going to talk a little bit about texture. Texture is my favorite. Texture, you know, can be very subtle and can be, you know, very vibrant. The thing about Mapbox, vector tiles, and GL in general is that it doesn't necessarily allow you to do certain comp ops that you used to be able to do. So like, for example, if you're in Photoshop, you can change the blending modes to something like multiply or darken, and you can kind of make the colors blend together a little bit more. We used to be able to do that in the last version of our tool, but in this version you really can't do that. So these are more like flat layers that you're manipulating of data. But using texture and using opacity, you can kind of start to emulate something that looks a little bit more like raster. So this is an example of a map style that is a raster style, or sorry, a vector style, but it's trying to go for a look that is more vintage, more rugged. So I created some textures within Adobe Illustrator and added them to the map. I also added a data layer to this, and the data is bathymetry data, so that's just the depth of water. And so within every different layer of bathymetry, I have a different opacity and a different pattern. I have like over 20 layers in this file for the water. Because
does that change the river speed when you add that much data to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not really, because it's using the same data set. So on the back end, it's smart enough to just kind of like optimize that and make it very performant. So I'm just using the same layer multiple times. Things that do affect it, though, are lots of typefaces and icons. So that's what you should watch out for that. So this is what the main pattern looked like. I also did some patterns that had the background color that I was using as well, and just put those into Studio and use them at various opacities to really, really get that texture and that tactile look going. So these are some patterns that I used for another map style. They have to be seamless. So, you know, if you put them next to each other and all around, there's no lines, so that when you apply them to the water or what have you, you won't see the lines. So that's really important. This style was more Roy Lichtenstein inspired pop art type style. And so the pattern was really important. And one cool thing with this is that I put the green pattern on the land use, which we have land use that is like park or national park or cemetery, lots of different types. And so using that green with a bit of opacity kind of creates some of these areas where there's like a double layer of texture. So again, it's just kind of like those small little moments that you can finesse with opacity and imagery. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the design principles. So these principles are pretty important as far as like making a map design. Legibility obviously being a very key thing, but these principles are the things that you're going to use when you're applying all of the elements that you've defined. So the first one we're going to talk about is contrast. So contrast is very important. I feel like I say everything's very important because it is. I wouldn't have put it in the guide if it wasn't important. So as you can see, like this is a pretty extreme example of contrast. Contrast is tricky because you don't want to make it too vibrant, but obviously you don't want your colors to muddy together and become muted. So playing with this contrast is very important. Being able to look at the background and foreground and kind of see some kind of spacing in there is important as well. And having variety within your color palette, as we mentioned before, is something else that you can play with the contrast. Another important thing with contrast is the text. So there's text halos that you can add, and you pretty much have to add them for every style. And it's just like a soft white line or gray line that I have here, but just something to kind of separate that foreground-background relationship, and contrast is very good to do that. But you don't want to overuse it, and you don't want to make it too extreme, especially if people are looking at things on a mobile phone. It's a lot more difficult to look at like something that has very, very high contrast. And then also there are people that have color visibility, what that word is, yeah. So anyway, and so that is something that you want to take into consideration if something is going to be visible to people who have different variations of color blindness. So data visualization. So contrast is very important for data visualizations. A lot of times I see a map that's beautiful, and then the data is like added to it and it's like plopped on top of it, and it's like not working with the map. So don't do that. When you're adding your data, you want to incorporate it into the experience. So you want to make sure that those colors have enough contrast and variance, but also are harmonious with the way that the map looks itself. And with data visualizations, you know, using a subtle background, but then applying the color into, you know, spot colors and locations is very effective as well. So you can kind of blend those two together when you have your data over your maps. So the next principle, hierarchy, which is very important, right? Typographic hierarchy is really fun, especially if you're working with a typeface that has lots of you know, weights and styles. So this is a typeface called Quebec, and I use this for my blueprint map, and this was also a design element for this map. So giving your labels different types of distinctions. So if you have a city label versus a neighborhood label, thinking about different ways to style it so that you can portray that hierarchy. And it can be anything that you want. Like maybe you want your neighborhoods to show a little bit more, or maybe you want, you know, your cities to show, like whatever it is that you want to specify, kind of putting them all together and figuring out how that relationship is going to go together is really important. And then obviously putting it on a map and making sure that it still looks good. We also have color hierarchy. So Boston is a really good location to look at for map design because The road networks are amazing, and there's water kind of in between it, kind of like Amsterdam, but not as much water. So Boston's a really good one. And you can see here that we have this highway coming through, which is shown in orange, and then we have this major roadway here that is yellow, and then white are primary roads. And all of these roads are styled in the same weight, but the only thing that's different is the color. So obviously, you know, the orange being the most high on the hierarchy, the yellow, and then the white. So little small subtle things like that, thinking about how your relationships in the same type of data like roads are working together and are stacked so that you can see that differentiation. And another hierarchy application is scale. So this is an example of streets that is using scale. We can see that the country name is a lot bigger, and we also have like Rome, a bigger city, some of these being smaller cities. So just being able to kind of think about, you know, the different ranking that you might put on your cities and your neighborhoods, and, you know, playing with that scale and seeing how that can be another thing to add a little bit of depth to your map. So the next principle is density. Density is really fun. So density is all about like timing and just like legibility, because, you know, with maps you have all of this information, and it's global information. So you start here at the world, and then you're able to come all the way down to street level. And so all of this data is available at different times. Our cartography team makes sure that we curate the data so it's not all like there in one on one layer, because that, first of all, would be not very performant, and it also would be very ugly. So even though you can have all the data at one time, you want to make sure that your density doesn't get overwhelming for your user, and you want to think about what type of device they're going to be looking at their map on, and make sure that you keep your density in a good location for that. And now we're going to talk about legibility, which is interesting because legibility is more about the ability for something to be comprehensible. So iconography is really something that you have to consider with legibility. You want to make sure that the way that you're drawing your shapes and how they look when they're very small is still legible. Because I mean, any of you who've made icons know that like it looked good real big, and then you make it small and you're like, what is that? So it's very important to make sure that you keep your styles. Like what we do is we put it on a pixel grid, and so we make sure that those, when that's resized, it looks really good. But then also just making sure that you simplify shapes and don't try to add too much detail because of, you know, making them smaller. We want them to continue to be legible. So legibility also with just the variation and the halos as well. So this is a very subtle thing, and in the guide I talk about it a lot more, but making these text halos so that when the icons or the text is over something different like water or the street, it still kind of has that ability to see that foreground background relationship. So, you know, be mindful of that. And then there's also proximity. So when you're working with a map style and a map design, there are going to be, you know, features that are overlapping. So in thinking about that, you want to probably provide as much differentiation as you can and kind of make sure that those relationships are sound as well. So, you know, be on the lookout when you're working on your map for different locations where features are really close together, because you want to make sure that that's a place where it's legible. A lot of times with the road networks, it gets really challenging because depending on how close you are to the road, the size of the width of the road can make it very illegible, especially if there's lots of roads like a train station or something like that. There's lots of lines. So you want to just kind of keep an eye out for those areas where there's overlap so you can make sure that it's still legible. Now we're going to talk about the special considerations. And so, you know, at MapLabs, our cartography team, we maintain and we create the core map styles that are available. But then we also have some more specific maps, some more specific use cases that we work with other teams on. Certain things like mobile definitely is one, navigation is also one. So in these considerations, what we found is that we have to think about the map as a part of something bigger, right? So if it's navigation, the map is probably going to be in the UI, on the dash, maybe in the car, or it might be on the mobile phone, and someone's just like glancing at it while they're like trying to hold themselves up on their mic or something like that. So really taking into consideration where your user's going to be, what they're going to be doing, how long they're going to have something, those are the types of things that we've really been thinking about a lot more as we work on these special maps. So mobile is one of the special considerations because we're, everybody like looks for things on their phone. Everybody uses their phone to find everything. Nobody looks at print maps anymore. And yeah, so really considering the scale there is really important. So like you're working with the same map, but the screen is smaller. So it's kind of like a cropped piece of the map that you're looking at. So it's really important to test. We have a few different tools in the guide. There are links to some of our tools, to one being Studio Preview, where you can look at the on the mobile phone, like what it would look like. So just kind of like taking those things into consideration, how a user is holding it, how far away they're holding it from their face, like just really ideating around the use case specifically and figuring out what types of problems you'll have to solve with your design. So the next thing is navigation. So there's lots of special considerations for navigation because, we have day and night. Obviously, that's one big one. That contrast level and also just like the eyes getting tired is something that's very important. We spent a lot of time on color for this one. Very subtle changes to color. And then also like different views. So like when something is navigation, a lot of times it's either in the guidance mode where you're looking at the entire trip, or it's in the mode where you're actually like driving the turn by turn. So those are different experiences that you have to consider when you're designing. How your map reads at those different places. A lot of maps turn slightly at angles and turn, this way and tilt as well. And so looking at how your maps are being rendered in those different ways, your labels are being rendered, how things are colliding, or maybe you need to change your density, that type of thing. So really just playing around with the map and trying to see. Another thing about navigation, other than the fact that it's going to be moving a lot and interactive, is that there's traffic. I know you guys have all like looked at Google Maps with traffic on it, right? Did you like it? Did it look awesome? I mean, it's kind of put on there. It's a little bit hard. So it's really a good thing to be able to try to make your traffic, like if it's something that's toggleable, or if it's something that's always permanently going to be there, it has a relationship with the road. And so that's just a way that something that we've thought about a lot, like how much of the road do we want to fill with the red or the green to indicate, if people should drive there. So little things like that. And data visualization. So there are many things to think about with data visualization. Of course, the guide has a lot more. There's also a blog post about choosing the right type of visualization for your data that you guys should check out, and that's linked to in the guide. But with data visualization, a lot of the considerations are around the information itself, like how do you want to categorize it? How can you categorize it so it'll be most honest to whatever is important to be, like, not the message that you're trying to convey, because a lot of times you just have to be true to the data, but whatever the data is trying to tell us, I guess. Another thing to think about is how much data you're going to have. So like looking at density, and then looking at kind of like what kind of read that you want people to have. Like, do you want them to quickly be able to see that there's like a lot of activity here, or do you want them to see kind of pockets of like in a chlorophyll that have like, different colors to indicate scale and density of people, population. And So towards the end, the second half, that's where we start to talk a lot more about Mapbox tools. So we talk about data, getting started with it. We talk a lot about zoom levels, which is kind of like, you know, how close you're getting into the street and considerations for that. And yeah, so I split it up into these two parts, which are Mapbox data, which we call tilesets, and I'll explain that in a second. And then we also have the Mapbox styles. So with the data, we call them tilesets because they are performant and they're ready to go as far as like web and a device. They are optimized for usage. But with data and data sets, that usually is something that you're continuing to maintain. It's like a raw PSD file versus a PNG or JPEG that's flattened kind of. So yeah, that's the terminology there. So within the data, we have global data, and we have points, lines, and polygons. So the points being place labels, water labels, POIs, which are points of interest. So all of that information being available at different zoom levels and being available. One thing that people don't always realize is the fact that we have so much data that you can use. So a lot of times you might have some custom data that you want to apply some special look to, but also dig into the data and see if it's there and it just hasn't been styled and it's available to you because we have a global set. And then the lines, which are like the road networks, waterways. Road networks have a lot of variety. They can be motorways, highways, they can be primary roads, they can be trunks. They can also be like secondary roads, that type of thing. So there's a lot of distinction. If you want to style something just with like major and minor roads and have it really simple, you can do that. Or if you want to add like every layer of detail down to paths and sidewalks, you can do that as well. So there's a lot of depth there with roads. And then the next type that we have here are polygons. So polygons typically represent like bodies of water or land, land use as well. So I talked a little bit about having like a cemetery land use or dog park or national park. There's lots of detail and specificity you can get with those as well. In polygons. And then I talk a little bit about the Mapbox styles. So these styles, which we looked at earlier, being light and dark, and then streets and outdoors. I talk a little bit about the icons that are used for all of them, the color palettes for them, what you would want to change and what you wouldn't want to change, and then also what the use case is. So you go into Studio and you're like, I just want to kind of like make my own style, but I want to start with something. A lot of times people use our template maps. So you might want to use the light map as your template and then just, you know, open that up and start customizing that and adding your design elements to it, or any of the other map styles as well. And that's actually the end of the presentation. So, what questions do you guys have?
Yes. There's a cat watching the live stream.
Yeah. Special, very special. Yes.
With traffic, is that built into the base map, or because traffic changes in like real time, right? Mm-hmm. Is that like a different like real time service that gets added, or something like that?
Yeah, so something like that. That is a service. It is basically our telemetry service. So that's capturing data, and it's totally anonymizing it, so it doesn't know like where somebody is, where they're going, but it is able to collect that information. And so historically, it looks at what the traffic patterns are for that, and I think that it's more hourly that it's updated. So that's how that data is.
And is that able to be that style able to be customized as well?
Yes, yes. It's just like any other vector data layer. It's something that is available to you in Studio. You can open up a traffic or a navigation style, and it will already be baked into that style, or you could just pull it into another style. I would recommend the navigation maps because those roads have been styled specifically for that traffic data. So, but yeah, good question. Yes.
Tiles give the impression of rasterized images. How do you distinguish between the actual tile sets and vector sets, which, and I'm not that experienced, I apologize, but how do I sort of resolve that difference?
So are you saying like a raster tile, like the?
That's what I think of. Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay.
So,
That's good. It took me, I had to ask to really understand this. So raster tiles are essentially multiple different tiles. So like if you're looking at zoom 0 and looking at the whole world, you're going to see one tile. But you go into zoom 1, get a little closer, and you're going to see 4 tiles. And so the tiles just continue to split as you get closer. And that's with raster tiles. Basically, another thing about raster tiles is it's flattened data for the most part. You can't change anything on the fly. You have to go back into the software, change it, and re-export it or re-render it. With vector data, those things are separate. So in the client, like really fast, the speed of like video games, that information is being drawn onto that vector data. So the vector data are kind of in those squares, but it's vector information. And so it's a lot lighter, and it's a lot more changeable.
when you get into the vector graphics, is the data larger or smaller? If you have to draw out the entire, like a river and a fine border of a river and the actual bank of the river, is it more data you're seeing or less? I assume less, but I don't know.
What do you mean by more or less data?
I don't know.
Are the tile sets heavier?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
They're not heavier. And the reason is because they're not flattened picture files, basically. So I don't know, like a good example, like a SVG is a good example. Like those are a lot lighter than a ping file would be because that's vector data and it's kind of drawn in the computer's language. And so it's not just a flat image. So they are a lot lighter overall.
Gotcha.
Any more questions? Yes.
Actually, we tried it both. So we used the map style, and we overlaid it with the NZ tile or the vector tile. So we had a problem that when you zoom in, the tile itself is covering the annotations for the base map. So is there a solution?
Yeah. So is your map performing as a GL map or does it have to be a raster?
Right.
Is your map ultimately a raster or is it actually a GL? Like, can you
That's
zoom
GL.
all the way in? It's GL.
That's what GL.
So that should be a pretty straightforward solution. If you go into the style itself, like how did you add the data to your style?
We used
Like GL.js, or did you do it in Studio?
GL.
Okay. So you would have to create another instance of the layer, but you would have to reorder the layers based on what the order they're in now. So like basically now your data layer is on top of all of the data that is with Mapbox Street. So you have to go and indicate which layers are going to be on top, should be on top. So like if that's like place names, what have you, and then you need to just write that into the JavaScript that layer is actually going to be on top, because the way that the JSON is formatted is that the order matters, and so it's like top to bottom. So like this is the bottom, it goes all the way down. So you just have to actually add that ordering into your GL.js. Does that make sense? So basically, find out what the layer names are, and the way that you can do that is if you open up the style, the names of the layers are right there. So you can use GL.js to just like isolate that name of that layer and say that you want it to be like in this order. And you would just take all the layers that you want to be on top and put them in that order in the code.
When you say you open style, you mean open Studio?
So when you open Studio, it's the style you're using, but it's only the layers that you want to be on top. Those are the layers that you'll have to indicate. And also in the guide, there is a link to a labels on top blog post. And so that really outlines basically what you have to do. And I think there's sample code there too.
Okay.
Sure. Yes.
Do you have like best practices in terms of going from desktop to mobile, in terms of interactivity and user experience? Like if I'm trying to build guides or things like that, do you sort of recommend sometimes, you know, cut out some interactivity on mobile, or how do you handle situations like that?
Yeah. So one thing is scale. We definitely make the icons a little bit bigger and the type a little bit bigger when we're working on mobile. And really having Studio Preview is super helpful because you can kind of see when you're on the desktop what it's going to look like in mobile. Another thing is density. A lot of times you want to take out some of the information, so you don't want to necessarily show all of the POIs. Maybe you look at the POIs at a certain scale rank, like the most important ones or the landmarks. And then just kind of playing with the level of contrast, especially like I think the foreground and the background is really important. So like just trying to make your saturation a little bit lower for certain things and a little bit higher for the things that you want to show up. That's something that we finesse a lot too with Meetup. And the guide has a lot more specifics too in it too. So. Yes.
So, do you guys have anything for disconnected clients? So, for example, somebody takes a laptop into the jungle for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, offline tiles. Yeah, so we do have offline tiles. I don't know if Anthony or Aaron can talk a little bit more about those tiles.
Go for it.
Yeah, so if you build with our mobile SDKs, right off the back, we're going to give you 6,000 offline tiles. So that'll give you, we think is enough to sort of get started, but if you need to increase that, you can contact us and we'll, you know, figure out what plan you need to get you even more tiles in there. But we have many customers that are using that sort of entry-level sort of limitation, and we have customers of ours that want to offer like complete parity, and they're doing millions of offline tiles. Obviously, you have to factor in what that does to the mobile device, et cetera. But yeah, we absolutely have that capability.
So, I'm assuming that it's something that they're here, they're connected to broadband, they do a one-time dump, and then they go off, do their thing, and then they come back.
Yeah, I mean, we can work with you on how to sort of deploy it, right? If you want to, you know, load these one time, or you know, however you want to do it. I mean, we have the flexibility to help you with that. It's more of a licensing thing than anything else.
But that same system, we can still apply the Mapbox Studio style systems, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
So you can use the GL styles and the vector data, but it will turn into a raster tile, so you won't have the same zoom kind of interaction. It'll be more like the staggered zoom, but it'll look the same.
Is there maybe this is sort of getting ahead, but is there a plan to sort of box up the vectorization so that you can put it on the road somewhere, or?
Not that I know.
We have that. $75,000 more a year.
Noted.
There you go, for the right
Let's
price.
talk after.
And the cool thing about Mapbox tools in general is that it's extremely customizable. So pretty much anything you want to build, if you want to build something internally, a tool for people to, you know, make maps styles or, you know, make maps to prints, you can build that tool using the APIs and the other data that we have. So it's kind of like a, you know, whatever it is that you want to build, it's capable with all of the pieces, the building blocks that we have.
It's a question from online. For implementing web maps, do you recommend sticking with Mapbox GLJS API, or are there still distinct use cases for using the original Mapbox JS?
That's a tough one. So I definitely recommend GLJS because it's more modern, and you can also use vector maps. But there are some use cases for clients that I know specifically that have like their entire stack for a client built with raster tiles, and so they have to use Mapbox GLJS. And sometimes it's a huge lift to change everything about a client's file. You don't want to, you know, go back and make changes to that. So a lot of people, like if they've already built something and they're not going to redo it, kind of like try to leave it in GLJS or leave it in JS as long as they can. But you also have to take into consideration depreciation, because once we kind of like, you know, move on to the next one, we don't have as much time to manage the ones from before. So I know with JS, we still have documentation up, but we don't necessarily like maintain it as much. So that's another consideration.
Can you speak more on the differences between those two?
Yeah. So really, and I haven't done as much on the programming end as far as like the interactivity with JS. But the biggest difference that I've noticed is that the tile sets that you're dealing with, just the fact that you're using the raster tiles and just the fact that you can't change anything on the fly is like a big deal. So with GLJS, you're basically saying like, I want to take that road and the layer name that, and I want to change that. You can't do that with JS. So I think that's the most major difference. Yes.
As a specialist in the field, do you or the Mapbox, I guess, have thoughts on the future of map design?
Oh, huh. Need a glass of wine for that one. I think it's really, I don't know, it's really interesting, especially when you think about autonomous cars and vehicles that, I mean, do robots need maps? I don't know. If robots are driving our cars, will we need maps? Maybe not. We've kind of had some topics that we've been exploring around the idea of the invisible map. That's something that we plan on digging into a little bit more, but just kind of like looking at data separate from the geography of it. And so that's kind of like one of those things that we're trying to get some headspace around. But, in general, just having better data is really, really key, and having stuff that I guess can change in real time, like especially when it comes to traffic, like a lot closer to actual times. And then there are cars that record certain things like the speed of the street, like Waze, I think uses a lot of like intelligence with just the hive mind and figuring out like if there's something broke down on the corner or whatever. So, just really employing different ways of getting timely information is another thing I see like being very important in the future. But yeah, that's a big question. What are your thoughts on that?
To learning.
So I had a quick question as it relates to pricing. I had seen plans change to a pay-as-you-go structure, and I'm curious if Mapbox ever has a plan to offer pricing for nonprofit organizations that are looking to sort of usher in these new like cutting-edge design tactics for building maps and into systems that are mainly used by underserved markets.
Right.
So I'm just curious if you had any plans to move in that direction.
Right. That's a really good. Aaron.
Yeah, you can.
Chief Discount Officer. Pleasure to meet you. My name's Aaron.
That's cool. Executive freeloader.
Cool. Any more questions? Cool. Well, thanks for coming, and please read the guide. And if you have feedback, tweet at me, tweet at Mapbox. We're very eager to hear and see what you make from the guide.